The security guard reached for his radio before the old man had even made it past the brass doors. By the time the man looked up at a crowded lobby and said, "This bank used to be mine," half the room was laughing and the other half was trying to decide whether to be nervous or entertained. 20 minutes later, the branch manager who had laughed the loudest would be staring at a yellowed ledger with both hands shaking, realizing the old man in the patched coat had not come in asking for money. He had come in asking for a name that had been stolen from him. It happened on a wet Tuesday afternoon in Bellwether, North Carolina, one of those grey little days when the sky hangs so low over Main Street it feels like it might scrape the church steeple, and everybody who came into Heritage Valley Bank that day was just trying to get out of the rain. Folks had umbrellas dripping by the front desk, coffee cups balanced on the counter, old men arguing quietly about interest rates, the usual small-town routine. Then the front door opened, and in walked Amos Raines. Amos was 81 years old, though he looked older in the way. Hard years can make a person look older without ever quite making them weak. His coat was dark brown, patched at both elbows, and too thin for the kind of weather Bellwether was having that week. His shoes were worn down at the heels, his wool cap was damp around the edges, and he carried a faded green canvas bag over one shoulder. It was the kind of bag people glance at and make up a whole story about before the owner has said a word. That was exactly what happened. A woman in a cream-colored raincoat pulled her purse closer against her side. A man waiting for the teller window took one step back. Behind the counter, two young employees looked at each other and tried not to smile, which usually means they were smiling anyway. Amos did not seem to notice any of it. Or maybe he noticed every bit of it and had simply spent too many years learning what not to give his attention to. He walked slowly across the marble floor, stopped beneath the old framed portrait of the bank's founder, and looked up at it for a long moment. The man in the portrait had silver hair, a stern jaw, and a heavy gold watch chain stretched across his vest. Underneath, in raised brass letters, was the name Everett Holloway, founder of Heritage Valley Bank, 1976. Amos stared at that name for a second longer than most people would have, then let out a quiet breath through his nose. It was not quite a laugh. It was not quite sorrow either. It was the sound a person makes when he's been carrying something too heavy for too long and finally decides to set it down in front of everybody. "That picture does not belong there," Amos said. Nobody heard him at first. The lobby was too busy, too full of little noises, keyboard taps, cash drawers opening, rain clicking against the tall front windows. Then Amos raised his voice just enough to cut through it. "That picture does not belong there," he said again. "This bank was mine before that man's family ever touched it." There was a pause and then the laughter came. Not everyone laughed, but enough people did. It started with a sharp little snort from a man sitting near the loan officer's desk. Then a young teller named Tyler made the mistake of trying to hide his grin behind his hand, and that was all it took. Within seconds, people were looking at Amos the way folks look at a stranger who has started arguing with a streetlight. One woman muttered, "Lord have mercy," like she had just been handed an inconvenience. The branch manager, Gavin Price, stepped out of his office with a look on his face that said somebody had interrupted an important spreadsheet. Gavin was 43, clean-shaven, well-dressed, and always just a little too pleased with how polished he looked. He had the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes, especially when he was dealing with someone he thought was beneath him. Gavin had been with Heritage Valley for 12 years, and he treated the bank's history like it was family history, even though he had not been born when most of it happened. He looked from Amos to the portrait, then to the guard standing near the entrance. "Dale," Gavin said, not raising his voice, "could you help this gentleman find his way back outside?" Dale Kincaid was built like a refrigerator with a buzz cut. He had worked security at the bank for almost a decade, but before that he had spent years as a deputy in the county sheriff's office, which meant he had a habit of standing as though every room belonged to him until somebody proved otherwise. He stepped forward, one hand close to his radio, the other hanging loosely beside his belt. "Sir," Dale said, "I'm going to need you to come with me." Amos looked at him, calm as a man waiting for a bus. "I did not come here for you," he said. "I came here because I'm done waiting for people like you to decide when I get to speak." That caught a few people off guard. Dale's jaw tightened. Gavin gave a patient little sigh, as though he had already decided Amos was just another problem that needed to be handled quietly before it embarrassed the bank. "Mr.?" Gavin asked. "Raines," Amos said. "Amos Raines." Gavin nodded without any sign that the name meant a thing to him. Mr. Rainey's Heritage Valley Bank has been in this building for 50 years. The Holloway family founded it. It is not an opinion. It is a matter of public record. Amos tilted his head and looked again at the portrait. Public record, he said softly. That is a fancy way of saying whoever had the money got to write the story. A few people shifted where they stood. The laughter had not vanished yet, but it had gotten quieter. Gavin kept his smile in place, though it was beginning to look like work. I am sure you have your reasons for believing that, he said. But this is a place of business. You cannot walk in here and make accusations because of something you remember differently. Amos's eyes settled on Gavin, and for the first time there was something sharp in them. Not anger exactly. It was closer to recognition. Like Amos had met men like Gavin his whole life and knew exactly what they did when the truth made them uncomfortable. I do not remember it differently, Amos said. I remember it correctly. Then he lowered the canvas bag from his shoulder and placed it carefully on the marble floor. That was when the mood in the room changed. It was not dramatic at first. Nobody gasped. Nobody dropped a cup of coffee. But people stopped laughing. The bag landed with a soft, heavy thump, and there was something about the way Amos touched it that made even Dale hesitate. He did not toss it down like a man carrying groceries. He placed it like a man laying a child to rest. Gavin glanced toward the bag and then back to Amos. What is in there? He asked. Amos looked at him. The part of the story your bank forgot to frame. Dale took a half step closer. Sir, I need to know what is in the bag. Amos did not move. No, you need to decide whether you are a guard or a bully, he said. Those are not always the same thing. The men like you spend years pretending they are. That hit Dale harder than Amos probably intended, or maybe exactly as hard as he intended. Dale had spent most of his life being praised for keeping order. But there is a difference between keeping order and protecting whatever has been powerful the longest. He had never thought much about that difference because nobody had ever made him. A young woman behind the teller counter watched Amos closely. Her name was Lila Monroe, and she had only been working at the bank for 8 months. Lila was the kind of person who listened before she spoke, not because she was timid, but because she had learned early that people told you more when they thought you were too quiet to notice. She had seen customers come in angry, drunk, scared, broke, confused, and occasionally all four at once. But Amos did not see many of those things. He seemed prepared. That bothered her more than anything. Gavin noticed people watching and decided he needed to take control before the whole thing turned into a scene he could not manage. Mr. Rains, he said, his voice firmer now. You have one chance to explain yourself. Then you are going to leave. Amos nodded slowly, like he had been waiting for that exact sentence. All right, he said. You want an explanation? Let me give you one. He reached down toward the bag. Dale moved instantly, hand coming up. Stop right there. Amos froze, not out of fear, but because he was tired. You could see it for just a second. Not tired in his bones, though there was some of that too. Tired in the deeper place, the place that gets worn down when you have had to convince people you deserve the same respect they hand out freely to everybody else. Amos looked at Dale's hand, then at Dale's face. Son, he said, quiet enough that everyone had to lean in to hear him. I have spent 50 years being told to stop right there. Stop asking, stop remembering, stop making decent people uncomfortable with ugly facts. I am not stopping today. Dale's face flushed. Gavin stepped forward quickly, worried now that the tension was pulling the whole lobby away from him. Fine, he said. Open the bag, but understand this. If there is anything suspicious in there, I will have you removed. Amos gave him a faint smile. That is the thing about the truth, Mr. Price. Men always call it suspicious right before it becomes expensive. Then he untied the frayed string around the top of the bag. For a moment, nobody breathed. Rain ran down the outside of the tall windows in long, crooked lines. The clock above the customer service desk ticked louder than it had any right to. Amos reached into the bag with both hands and pulled out a leather ledger, dark with age, its corners worn smooth from years of being opened and closed. He set it on the floor in front of him. Then he took out a bundle of old paper currency wrapped in twine, then another, then a stack of legal documents sealed inside a yellowed oilcloth folder. The bills were not modern. Anyone could see that. They had the old bank insignia printed across them, a crest nobody in the room recognized at first, except Gavin did. His expression changed so quickly Lila almost missed it. The old crest was there, faint but unmistakable, pressed into the lower corner of the bills. A cedar tree inside a circle with the words Rains and Holloway Savings House beneath it. Gavin had seen that symbol once before, years ago, in a locked archive cabinet at the regional office. He'd assumed it was some early version of the bank logo, nothing more. But now it was lying on the floor at the feet of an old man everyone had been laughing at. Amos picked up the ledger and held it against his chest. His hands were rough, his fingers bent by arthritis, but his grip was steady. "This," he said, "is the original account book from the first year this bank opened." Gavin stared at him. "That is impossible." Amos looked almost amused by that. "No," he said. "Impossible is what you people called it when I told you I would come back." He opened the ledger to the first page. The paper was thin and brittle, the ink faded, but still readable. There were columns of handwritten numbers, names, deposits, loan amounts, notes in the margin. Near the top was a heading written in dark blue ink, Rains and Holloway Savings House, July 1976. Beneath it were two signatures. One belonged to Everett Holloway, the other belonged to Amos Rains. Lila leaned over the counter to get a better look. Tyler stopped smiling. The woman in the cream-colored raincoat took one small step closer, as though curiosity had finally beaten fear. Gavin crouched down slowly, like he did not trust his legs to carry him. He reached toward the ledger, then stopped before touching it. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Amos looked at him for a long time. "I kept it," he said. "That is what people do when the world spends half a century trying to erase them." Gavin swallowed. "You are saying you founded this bank?" Amos shook his head once. "No," he said. "I am saying I built it. There is a difference." That was the first moment nobody laughed. Not one person. The old man in the patched coat stood beneath a portrait that had carried another man's name for 50 years, holding proof that the story people had been taught might have been a lie. And Amos Rains had not even told them the worst part yet. He had not told them how Everett Holloway had been his partner before he became his enemy, how a loan made in bad faith had turned into a quiet theft, how a town full of decent people had looked away because looking away was easier than admitting who they had chosen to believe. Amos looked around the lobby, at the customers, the tellers, the guard, the manager, all of them standing there with their wet coats and their little routines suddenly interrupted by a past none of them had known existed. Then he turned back to Gavin Price and said, "You asked me why I came here. I came because your bank has been living in my house for 50 years, and I finally brought the receipt." The words sat in the lobby like a glass somebody had dropped, but nobody had heard break yet. "I came because your bank has been living in my house for 50 years, and I finally brought the receipt." Gavin Price looked down at the ledger again, then at the old bills spread across the floor, and for the first time that afternoon he did not look irritated, he looked scared. Not scared of Amos exactly, not yet, but scared of what happens when a clean story starts getting fingerprints all over it. He picked up one of the old notes with 2 fingers, like it might burn him, and turned it over. The paper was thin, yellow at the edges, and stamped with that cedar tree emblem none of the current employees had ever seen outside a history display. Rains and Holloway Savings House. The name was right there, plain as daylight, printed across the top in faded black ink. Tyler, the teller who had been smirking a few minutes earlier, leaned closer and said, "Is that real?" Amos gave him a look that was not cruel, just tired. "Son, fake money usually looks little newer than 40 years old." A few people almost laughed, but nobody quite had the nerve. The air had changed too much for that. Gavin straightened up slowly, holding the bill in one hand and the ledger in the other, and he tried to put his manager face back on, that calm little expression people wear when they think their job title should settle an argument. "Mr. Rains," he said, "even if these documents are genuine, they do not prove ownership of this bank today." Amos nodded once. "You are right," he said. "A ledger does not prove everything. It proves where you ought to start asking questions." Then he bent down and opened the oilcloth folder. Inside were old loan agreements, tax records, hand-typed meeting notes, copies of deeds, and a photograph that had been folded so many times the creases had nearly cut through it. Amos held the photograph up for everyone to see. It showed 2 younger men standing in front of a small brick building with a hand-painted sign above the door. One was white, wearing a grey suit and a wide grin, his arm thrown over the shoulder of the other man. The other man was Amos, younger by half a century, standing taller than anybody expected him to, wearing a dark tie and holding a ring of keys in one hand. Below the photograph, written in blue ink, were the words, "Opening Day, July 12, 1976. Amos Raines at Everett Holloway." Leila Monroe came out from behind the counter before she even realized she was moving. She had been watching every little thing, the way Amos kept his papers in order, the way Gavin's face changed whenever he saw a name or a date, the way Dale Kincaid had gone from standing tall to standing still. "Can I see that?" she asked softly. Amos looked at her for a moment, then handed it over. Leila studied the picture, her eyes narrowing. "I have seen this before," she said. Gavin looked at her fast. "No, you have not." Leila did not look up. "Yes, I have. There is an old anniversary scrapbook in the storage room downstairs. The bank kept it after the merger. I remember it because somebody had taped a copy of this picture near the back. Only—" She stopped. Amos watched her carefully. "Only what?" Lala swallowed. "Only the man on the left was cropped out." Nobody said anything for a second. Even Dale shifted his weight. Amos did not look surprised, and somehow that made it worse. He just gave a small nod, like he had expected the answer before she said it. "They did that in the papers too," he said it. "They did that in the papers too," he said. "First they left my name out. Then they left my face out. After a while, folks started acting like I had never been there at all." Gavin stepped forward. "Leila, do not go downstairs." His voice came out sharper than he meant it to, and everybody heard it. She finally looked at him. "Why not?" Gavin hesitated. There are moments when a person can feel the whole room watching them decide what kind of person they are going to be, and that was one of those moments. He cleared his throat. "Because we do not need employees digging through archives while we are dealing with a disturbance." Amos let out a quiet breath. "A disturbance," he said. "That is a good word for it. A man brings proof he was robbed, and suddenly, the proof is the problem." Dale took a step forward. "Watch it." Amos turned toward him, and the whole room seemed to tighten again. "You know what I have learned, Mr. Kincaid?" Amos asked. Dale did not answer. People who have never had anything taken from them get real nervous when somebody starts talking about what is theirs. Dale's hand drifted toward his belt, not touching the holster, but close enough for everyone to notice. Leila noticed too. She looked from Dale to Amos, then back to Gavin. Something in her face changed. It was not bravery all at once, not the kind you see in movies where somebody suddenly becomes fearless. It was more like she had reached the point where staying quiet felt worse than being scared. "I am going downstairs," she said. Gavin stared at her. "Leila." "I am going downstairs," she repeated, and then she walked past him before he could stop her. Tyler watched her go, then looked at Amos, then at the ledger. He had spent the first 10 minutes of the afternoon treating the old man like a joke, and now he looked like a kid who had just realized he had laughed at the wrong funeral. Amos saw it. "You can stop looking like that," he told him. Tyler blinked. "Like what?" "Like somebody just told you Santa Claus sold bad mortgages." A couple people let out a nervous laugh this time, real laughter but small, the kind that comes from pressure leaving the room for 1 second. Even Amos smiled a little. It did not last long. Gavin walked toward his office and pulled his phone from his pocket. He tried to keep his voice low, but the branch was too quiet now. Everybody could hear enough. "I need to speak with Mrs. Holloway," he said. There was a pause. "No, not later. Now." Amos did not move, but something behind his eyes went distant. He had heard that name in too many rooms, spoken by too many people who thought the Holloways were a weather system, something powerful and permanent that ordinary people just had to live under. Everett Holloway had been dead for nearly 15 years, but his family still owned the holding company that controlled most of Heritage Valley's board, along with a good piece of downtown Bellwether, 3 apartment complexes, a private hunting club outside county limits, and enough local politicians to make any conversation about fairness feel like a bad joke. Amos had known Everett before all of that, before the family money, before the fancy charity dinners, before the portrait hanging in the lobby, back when Everett was just a young white man with a good handshake, a business degree, and a way of looking at Amos like he was the smartest man in the room. Amos had believed him. That was the part that had hurt longest. It was easy to hate a man who had always hated you. It was harder to understand a man who shook your hand, called you brother, ate supper at your table, then waited until he had enough power to bury you alive under paperwork. Amos had met Everett Holloway in 1973, when Amos was working 2 jobs and still fixing radios out of his garage on weekends. He had a mind for numbers, always had. He could tell you by looking at a ledger which business was growing, which family was stretching too thin, which farm was going to make it through a bad season if somebody gave him one fair chance. The banks in Bellwether did not see people that way. They saw last names, zip codes, church memberships, skin color, who had a father with land and who did not. Amos saw work. He saw potential. He saw people nobody else bothered to notice. Everett had seen Amos at a town council meeting, standing up in the back of the room and calmly explaining why small business loans should not require the same kind of collateral as a commercial development project. Everett had come over afterward and said, "You know, you make a lot of rich men look lazy." Amos had laughed. "That is because most of them are." Everett liked that answer. Or maybe he liked the idea of owning the man who gave it. At first, their partnership made sense. Amos had the community trust and the financial instincts. Everett had the connections and the access to investors who would not sit down across a table from a black man in 1970s North Carolina, no matter how good his numbers were. They called it Rains and Holloway Savings House because Amos insisted his name come first. Everett agreed right away, smiling wide, saying, "Of course it should. You are the one who had the idea." They opened in a 2-room brick office with a coffee pot that burned every afternoon and a hand-painted sign Amos's cousin made for $20 and a plate of barbecue. Their first customers were teachers, mechanics, church ladies, a couple who ran a laundromat, and a widower named Mr. Baines who came in every Friday just to deposit $6 and tell Amos how good the country would be if more people acted like him. The bank grew because Amos made loans others would not. Not reckless loans, not charity, just fair ones. He gave a carpenter money to buy a second truck. He helped a single mother refinance a house that a bigger bank had nearly taken from her. He loaned a local farmer enough to repair irrigation after a storm and refused to punish him when the crop came in late. People paid Amos back because he treated them like neighbors, not numbers. Within 3 years, Rains and Holloway was making more money than anybody had expected, and that was when Everett started changing. It was small at first. A meeting Amos was not invited to, a report that came to him late, a new investor who seemed to talk only to Everett. Then came the development deal. Everett's brother, Calvin Holloway, wanted to build a strip mall on the north side of town. It was a bad idea from the start. Too much debt, too little demand, and a whole lot of optimism from men who thought they could build their way out of any problem. Amos said no. He ran the numbers 3 times, then sat across from Everett in the office they had built together and told him, "If we approve this, we are putting the bank on a shaky floor just so your brother can sell overpriced storefronts to people who cannot afford them." Everett leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and smiled that same old smile Amos had once trusted. "You worry too much," Everett said. "That is why we balance each other out." "No," Amos said. "That is why one of us needs to listen." Everett did not listen. He pushed the loan through anyway, using a new group of board members he had brought in quietly over the previous year. Men Amos had never met, men who had never stepped foot in the bank until the paperwork was almost done. When the strip mall project started losing money, Everett needed somebody to blame, and Amos, the man whose name was on the sign, became the easiest target. They said he had taken too many risks with community lending. They said he did not understand modern banking. They said he was too emotional, too attached to people, too proud. Then, when none of that quite worked, they said what they had been thinking all along, only they said it in the polite language men use when they want prejudice to sound like business sense. They said the bank would be more stable if it had a leader who made certain investors comfortable. Amos had known what that meant. He did not need anybody to spell it out. He fought them anyway. He brought records. He brought the original partnership agreement. He showed that Everett had been moving money out of community accounts to cover Calvin's failed project. He thought the numbers would save him, because numbers were supposed to be the one thing nobody could argue with. But the board did not care about numbers. The board cared about who was sitting in the room. Everett had the family name, the attorneys, the donors, the men who played golf with judges and called one another by first name at charity auctions. Amos had a stack of papers and the belief that facts should matter. That belief cost him almost everything. One Friday morning in 1981, Amos arrived at the bank and found his key no longer worked. The sign had been changed overnight. Rains and Holloway Savings House was gone. In its place was Holloway Valley Bank. His name had been painted over so neatly it looked like it had never been there. Amos stood on that sidewalk for nearly an hour, holding a cardboard box with his personal files in it, while customers he had known for years walked past him and pretended not to see. Some were ashamed. Some were afraid. Some probably thought it was none of their business. But silence has a way of joining the side that is already winning. Amos took the Holloways to court. Twice. The first lawyer told him he had a strong case, then called 3 days later and said his office could not represent him after all. The second lawyer took his money, filed 2 motions, and suddenly became impossible to reach. By the time Amos got in front of a judge, the board records had been altered. Key documents had gone missing, and Everett was sitting 3 rows behind the bank's attorney wearing a navy suit and the face of a man watching somebody else get buried. Amos never forgot that face. He had not thought about it in years. Not until he saw the portrait in the lobby and felt the same old pressure building behind his ribs. "Mr. Rains?" Gavin's voice pulled him back to the present. Amos looked up. Gavin had ended the call, and whatever he had heard on the other end had drained the color from his face. "Mrs. Holloway says you need to leave the premises immediately," Gavin said. Amos smiled without warmth. "Did she ask what I brought?" "She said your documents may be private property belonging to the bank." Amos let out a small laugh then, the kind that had no humor in it. "Private property," he said. "That family has been calling my life private property since before you were born." Dale stepped closer again. "Mr. Raines, I am asking you one last time to leave voluntarily. And I am telling you one last time," Amos said. "I am not leaving those papers with people who have spent 50 years hiding them." Dale's eyes hardened. "You do not get to make demands in here." Amos took a step toward him. He was smaller, older, slower, and yet Dale backed up before he could stop himself. Amos noticed. "So did everybody else." "That is where you are wrong," Amos said. "I have spent my whole life being told I did not get to make demands. I did not get to demand a fair loan. I did not get to demand my own name on the building I helped pay for. I did not get to demand a judge look me in the eye. But I am not asking today. I am giving notice." Before Dale could answer, Leela came hurrying back from the hallway carrying a dusty binder against her chest. Her hair had come loose from its clip, and there was a smudge of grey dust across her cheek, but her eyes were wide and certain. "I found it," she said. Gavin moved toward her. "Leela, give me that." She held the binder tighter. "No." The word was quiet, but it landed hard. The word was quiet, but it landed hard. Tyler actually looked impressed. Lila opened the binder on the customer service desk and flipped through brittle plastic sleeves until she found the page she needed. It was a copy of the same opening day photograph Amos had brought, only this one had not been cropped. There stood Amos Raines, front and center, holding the keys. Everett Holloway stood beside him, smiling for the camera. Behind them, a handwritten note said, "Co-founders of Raines and Holloway Savings House celebrate opening day with local depositors." Lila placed the picture next to the old ledger. "This was in the bank archive," she said. "It has been here the whole time." Gavin stared at it, his mouth slightly open. "That does not prove current ownership," he said, but his voice did not have much fight left in it. Amos looked at him. "No, Gavin. It proves somebody knew I existed." That was when a man near the loan desk raised his phone. "I am recording this," he said. Nobody stopped him. Then the woman in the cream-colored raincoat did the same. Then the Tyler. Then 2 more customers. The phones came out one by one, not because people suddenly became heroes, but because the story had gotten too big to ignore and everybody wanted proof they had been there when the official version started falling apart. Gavin looked around the room and realized he was losing control of it. The bank had always run on order. Quiet voices, numbered tickets, polished floors, little signs telling people where to stand. But none of that mattered when history walked through the front door wearing a patched coat and carrying better records than the people behind the counter. His phone rang again. This time he looked at the screen and did not answer right away. Amos saw the name, Margaret Holloway. Gavin finally answered and put it on speaker by accident, or maybe by panic. Her voice came through cold and clear. "Gavin, I told you to remove him. Gavin swallowed. Mom, there are documents, old records. People are filming. There was a pause on the line, a pause so long the whole room could hear the rain again. Then Margaret Holloway said, "Do not let those papers leave that building." Amos closed his eyes for just a second. Not because he was defeated, because some things hurt even when you have been expecting them for 50 years. He opened his eyes and looked at Gavin. "There it is," he said. "That is the family business right there. Not banking, not service, just taking what is not theirs and calling it protection." Dale reached for the folder. Amos caught it first. The two men stood inches apart, one with a hand around old papers, the other with a hand hovering near his belt, while outside, somewhere beyond the rain-streaked glass, a police siren began to rise from the far end of Main Street. Leela looked toward the doors. Tyler stopped breathing. Gavin looked like he wanted to disappear into his office wall. And Amos Raines held the folder against his chest, staring at Dale Kincaid with the same steady eyes he had carried through 50 years of being ignored. "Go ahead," Amos said. "Take it from me." Dale's fingers flexed. Amos did not blink. "But before you do, you ought to know what is in the last envelope. Because if I am right, it is not just proof they stole my bank." He looked toward Gavin, then at the phone still glowing on the counter with Margaret Holloway's name on it. "It is proof they knew they stole it. It is proof they knew they stole it. It is proof they knew they stole it." For a second, nobody moved. The siren outside got louder, then stopped somewhere near the curb, and you could feel the whole room waiting to see whether the next thing through those doors would be help or just another kind of trouble. Dale Kincaid looked at the folder in Amos Raines's hands, then at the front entrance, then back at Amos, and his face had changed in a way that was hard to miss. All afternoon, Dale had been acting like this was simple, like there was an old man causing a scene and a security guard doing his job, neat little boxes with clear labels. But now there was a ledger on the floor, an uncut photograph and a dusty archives book, a phone call from Margaret Holloway telling Gavin not to let the papers leave the building, and a whole lobby full of customers holding up their phones. Simple had left the room a while ago. "What is in the envelope?" Gavin asked. His voice sounded smaller than it had 10 minutes earlier. Amos looked down at the oilcloth folder, then ran his thumb across the worn edge of it. "A letter," he said, "and some meeting notes. I found them in a box my wife kept after I passed out in the courthouse parking lot in 1982. The name of his wife seemed to slow him down. He had not mentioned her before. Lila was standing near the customer service desk, still holding the old archive binder, and she noticed the way Amos's grip tightened when he said it. "Her name was Ruth," Amos continued. "Ruth Raines. She believed in saving things. Receipts, letters, birthday cards, newspaper clippings, even little notes people left on the kitchen table. Drove me crazy sometimes. I used to tell her, 'Honey, one day this house is going to collapse under the weight of every grocery receipt we ever had.' She would say, 'Good, then at least history will know we bought milk.'" A few people smiled at that, softly, carefully, because it was the first thing Amos had said all day that sounded like a memory from a life that had not been entirely pain. His face softened for only a moment, then he looked at the portrait above him again. "When I lost the case, I came home ready to burn every paper I owned. I was angry, embarrassed, tired. I thought if the courts would not listen, then the papers were just reminders of how foolish I had been to trust anyone." Ruth sat me down at our kitchen table, put her hand over mine and said, "Amos, do not throw away the only witnesses who cannot be bought." So we kept them, every last one. Dale shifted again. "Sir, the police are here," he said. "You need to hand that folder over." Amos did not raise his voice. "To who?" he asked. "You." He asked, "You." Dale's jaw tightened. "To law enforcement. And then what? It disappears into a property room, gets labeled as disputed material, and somehow ends up back in the hands of the people who have been trying to make me disappear since 1981? Dale took a breath through his nose. You could tell he wanted to snap back, but he did not. Maybe it was the phones. Maybe it was Leela watching him. Maybe it was the simple fact that Amos was not acting like a man with something to hide. He was acting like a man who had spent half a lifetime waiting for somebody to finally ask the right question. The front doors opened, and two bellwether police officers stepped inside, rainwater shining on their shoulders. The older one was Sergeant Elena Brooks, a woman in her late 40s with tired eyes and the kind of calm posture that made everybody else lower their voice without being told. Behind her was Officer Mason Cole, younger, broad-shouldered, still looking around the lobby like he was trying to figure out whether somebody had called in a robbery, a fight, or a very strange family reunion. Dale moved toward them first. "Sergeant, this gentleman has been causing a disturbance and refusing to leave private property." Amos gave a faint laugh. "That is interesting," he said. "I've been called a lot of things today, but that may be the first honest sentence anyone has said. I am refusing to leave what was once private property." Sergeant Brooks did not react to the joke, but there was something in her eyes that said she heard the difference. "Sir," she said, "what is your name?" "Amos Rains." She paused. Just a flicker, barely there. "Rains," she repeated. Amos looked at her. "You know it? My father did," she said. "He works at the textile plant. He said there used to be a bank in town that gave men like him a chance when nobody else would." Amos stared at her for a moment, and something in his face loosened. "Your father was Henry Brooks?" Sergeant Brooks nodded slowly. Amos looked down at the floor. "Henry bought his first truck with a loan from me, paid every cent back 6 months early because he said he did not like owing anybody enough to lose sleep." Sergeant Brooks let out a breath, almost a laugh. "That sounds like him." The room got quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet. It was not fear, it was recognition. A thread from the past had just pulled itself into the present, and suddenly Amos was not just an old man with a folder. He was somebody people remembered, even if the bank had not. Gavin stepped forward quickly, sensing that the ground under him was moving. "Sergeant, we have reason to believe those documents may belong to Heritage Valley Bank." Amos turned toward him. "No, you have reason to believe they may prove Heritage Valley Bank owes me more than an apology." Sergeant Brooks held up one hand. "Everybody slow down. No one is taking anything from anyone right now. Mr. Rains, would you be willing to show me what is in that envelope?" Amos looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes, Mom, but I want it read where everybody can hear it." Gavin shook his head. "That is not appropriate." Amos looked at him. Neither was erasing a man for his own bank, but here we are. The people in the lobby did not laugh this time. They did something worse for Gavin. They agreed with their silence. Sergeant Brooks looked at the phones pointed toward them, at the documents on the floor, at the branch manager sweating through his collar, then at Amos. "All right," she said. "Read it." Amos opened the folder carefully. Inside was a thin envelope, yellowed along the edges with Everett Holloway's name typed in the upper left corner. The seal had already been broken decades ago. Amos pulled out a carbon copy of a letter and unfolded it slowly. His hands were steady now, maybe because, after 50 years, there was nothing left to be nervous about. He held the page close, squinted once at the faded words and began to read. "To Mr. Calvin Holloway and Counsel. Regarding the removal of Amos Rains from the savings house, it is essential that all records reflect a voluntary transfer of his shares and withdrawal from management. Mr. Rains has not agreed to those terms and is unlikely to do so. Therefore, documentation must be prepared in a manner that prevents future dispute. The board should avoid any written acknowledgement of the internal loan transfers related to Northside commercial development. If Rains challenges the matter publicly, his reputation must be treated as a liability to the institution." Omar stopped reading. Nobody made a sound. Not one keyboard clicked. Not one cash drawer opened. Even the rain seemed quieter against the glass. Gavin looked like he had forgotten how to breathe. Lila covered her mouth with one hand. Tyler stared at the floor. Dale stood with his arms at his sides now, no longer close to his belt, no longer standing like the room belonged to him. Amos turned the letter over and held up the bottom of the page. "Signed Everett Holloway," he said. "Dated March 4th, 1981. Then he took out a second document, a typed summary from what appeared to be a board meeting. Several names were listed at the top, including Everett Holloway, Calvin Holloway, 2 attorneys, and 3 members of the board. One line had been underlined in red ink years ago. Amos read it slowly. The removal of Mr. Rains must be finalized before the annual audit. Any acknowledgement of the partnership structure may expose the institution to claims of improper transfer, misrepresentation, and discriminatory intent. He lowered the page. "They knew," he said. "They knew exactly what they were doing. They did not make a mistake. They did not misunderstand me. They did not forget my name. They decided my name was inconvenient. Gavin stared at the papers as if they had become something alive. He had spent years defending the bank without ever needing to think about what exactly he was defending. That was the comfort of working inside a powerful place. You could call it tradition. You could call it reputation. You could call it protecting jobs. But sometimes all those words were just clean curtains hanging in front of a dirty window. His phone rang again. Margaret Holloway. Nobody said anything, but everybody watched him look at the screen. Amos did not tell him to answer. He did not need to. Gavin pressed the button and Margaret's voice came through sharp and controlled. "Gavin, what is happening?" Gavin swallowed. "Mrs. Holloway, there are police officers here. Mr. Holloway, there are police officers here. Rains has documents, and some of them appear to be signed by your father." There was silence on the line. Not confusion, not surprise, just silence. Then Margaret said, "Put the officer on." Sergeant Brooks stepped closer, took the phone from Gavin, and listened while Margaret spoke in a lower voice. Nobody else could hear the details, but they could read the change in the sergeant's expression. It went from polite to flat. After a minute, Sergeant Brooks said, "No, ma'am, I am not removing him. And no, I am not confiscating documents without a proper evidence review. You may want to contact an attorney." She ended the call and handed the phone back to Gavin. "Mr. Price," she said, "I need the branch closed for the day. Nobody touches these documents. Nobody removes anything from the archive room. I am calling the county investigator and the state financial crimes unit." Gavin nodded, but it took him a second. His mind was still trying to catch up. "Yes, Sergeant." Dale looked at him. "You are really going to shut the branch down over this?" Gavin looked at Dale, then at Amos, then at the portrait of Everett Holloway hanging above the lobby. "I think," he said quietly, "the branch has been closed over this for 50 years. We just did not know it." That was the moment Dale finally understood that order and justice were not the same thing. He had spent his career believing that keeping the peace meant keeping things from changing. But standing there in that lobby, looking at the old man he had been ready to throw out into the rain, Dale saw what he had been protecting. Not people, not safety, a lie with a polished floor. He walked over to the brass stanchion near the entrance, lifted the velvet rope and placed it across the doors. Then he turned the sign around so it read, "Closed." It was a small act, nothing heroic, but it was the first honest thing he had done all day. Amos watched him, then nodded once. Dale did not look proud. He looked ashamed. "Mr. Rains," he said, "I owe you an apology." Amos studied him. "You do," he said. Dale gave a short, humorless laugh. "Fair enough." He looked down at the old bills scattered across the marble floor. "I thought you were here to cause trouble." Amos bent slowly and picked one up. "I was," he said. "Some trouble deserves to be caused." Lila laughed before she could stop herself. This time Amos smiled for real. It changed his whole face. For a few seconds he did not look like a man carrying 50 years of grief. He looked like the young banker in the opening day photograph, the one holding the keys and believing his work might matter. The investigators arrived an hour later. By then, the lobby had mostly emptied, though a handful of people stayed outside under umbrellas waiting for news. Tyler had called his grandmother, who came down in her slippers and raincoat, because she remembered Amos from when she was a child. She stood in the doorway, looked at him for a long time, then said, "You gave my daddy a loan when nobody else would." Amos looked at her and seemed to recognize something in her face. "You are Raymond Coleman's girl," he said. She nodded, crying now. "He talked about you every Christmas." Amos looked away, his eyes wet. "Your daddy was a good man." She stepped forward and hugged him. It was not a dramatic embrace. It was awkward, tender, the kind where two people are both surprised by how much a forgotten memory can still weigh. After that, more people started talking. A retired mechanic said Amos had helped him keep his shop open after his mother got sick. A woman from the church remembered Ruth Rains bringing food to families whose homes were being foreclosed. A man in a denim jacket said his grandfather used to curse Everett Holloway every time the name came up, but nobody had ever told him why. The story began changing right there in the lobby, not because the bank released a statement or because some attorney approved the language, but because people finally started remembering out loud. That is how silence breaks sometimes, not with a shout, with one person saying, "I remember that too." The investigation took months. Nothing about it was quick, and nothing about it was clean. The Holloway family hired attorneys from Charlotte, then Raleigh, then one from Atlanta, who wore expensive suits and spoke like every sentence had been polished in a boardroom. They argued that the documents were old, incomplete, misinterpreted. They said Amos's memory could not be trusted. They said business practices had been different in 1981. They said the current bank should not be held responsible for the actions of people who were dead. And maybe from a legal standpoint, some of that had weight. That was the ugly part. The law is not always a clear window. Sometimes it is a maze built by people who already know where the exits are. But the letter was real. The ledger was real. The ledger was real. The archive photograph was real. And the meeting notes opened a door the Holloways could not close. An independent forensic accountant found evidence that the Northside development losses had been shifted into accounts connected to the original savings house. A historian from the State Banking Commission found early records showing Amos had been listed as co-founder in licensing documents, then removed from later filings without a valid transfer document. The investigation could not undo every wrong that had been done. It could not give Amos back the years he had spent driving a delivery truck after losing the bank. It could not bring Ruth back to see his name restored. It could not erase the days he had sat at his kitchen table, wondering whether he had failed his children by trusting the wrong people. But it could say the thing nobody had been willing to say before. Amos Raines had been cheated, publicly, deliberately, and not by accident. 6 months after that rainy Tuesday, Heritage Valley Bank held a press conference in the same lobby where Amos had been laughed at. The marble floor had been polished. The portrait of Everett Holloway was gone. In its place was a blank rectangle on the wall where the paint had not faded yet, like the building itself was embarrassed by what it used to display. Gavin Price stood behind a small podium, looking older than he had 6 months earlier. He had kept his job, though just barely, mostly because he had cooperated with the investigation and testified about the call from Margaret Holloway. But he did not look like the same man. Some people said he had grown a conscience. Others said he had simply realized he was on the wrong side of a story that had too many witnesses. Maybe both were true. Lila stood near the front with her mother and father. Tyler was there too, wearing a tie that looked like it had been borrowed from somebody taller. Dale stood by the entrance in uniform, but he was not blocking the door this time. He was holding it open. Amos arrived in the same green canvas bag and the same brown coat, though Leela had convinced him to let her buy him a new pair of shoes. He had argued about it for 20 minutes. Said the old ones still had miles left in them. Leela told him, Mr. Rainey's. Those shoes have seen enough history. Amos had looked at them, then looked at her and said, "All right, but I am keeping the old pair. They have earned retirement." When he walked into the lobby that day, nobody laughed. People stood. Not because somebody told them to, they just did. The chairman of the newly reorganized board announced that the bank would formally recognize Amos Raines as co-founder of the original institution. The bank had agreed to a financial settlement, the amount of which was not made public, and to fund the Amos and Ruth Raines Community Lending Trust, a program designed to give fair access to small business loans, home repair loans, and emergency credit for people who have been ignored by traditional banks. The board also agreed to remove the Holloway name from the historical display, preserve the original records, and install a permanent plaque telling the full story of the bank's founding. It was not perfect. Amos knew that. No plaque can return 50 years. No settlement can make betrayal feel reasonable. But when the chairman asked Amos if he wanted to say a few words, he walked to the podium slowly, set his old canvas bag beside him, and looked out at the crowd. Reporters were there, town council members, former employees, people who had come because they cared, and people who had come because they wanted to be seen and caring. Amos knew the difference. He had always known the difference. He had always known the difference. He cleared his throat and said, "I have been asked whether I feel like I won." The room went quiet. Amos looked toward the empty space where Everett Holloway's portrait had once hung. "I do not know if winning is the right word," he said. "Winning would have been getting to keep what I built. Winning would have been my wife seeing this day. Winning would have been not having to spend half my life proving I was not crazy for remembering the truth." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice softened. "But I will say this, I do not feel invisible anymore." That was all he said at first. Then he looked toward Lila. And I learned something from the people who stood up when they did not have to. You cannot fix the past by pretending it did not happen. You fix it by telling the truth where people can hear it, then doing something useful with the shame. There was applause, but it did not come all at once. It started with Leela, then Tyler, then Dale, then the whole room. Amos stood there with tears in his eyes, not smiling big, not soaking up the moment, just letting it happen, like a man finally accepting that maybe he had not carried those papers alone for nothing. After the crowd cleared out, Amos stood in front of the new plaque with Leela. It read, "In recognition of Amos Rains, co-founder of Rains and Holloway Savings House, whose vision of fair lending helped build this community." Leela read it quietly, then looked at him. "Do you think it is enough?" she asked. Amos stared at the words for a while. "No," he said. Lila looked surprised. Amos smiled a little. "But it is a start, and starts matter more than people think." She nodded, then glanced toward the new lending trust office being set up near the back of the building. "What are you going to do now?" Amos picked up the canvas bag. "First, I am going home and making myself a real sandwich. I've been eating vending machine crackers since sunrise." Lila laughed. Amos started toward the door, then stopped and looked back at the bank one last time. "After that," he said, "I might come back next week and see who needs a loan." And that is the part people still argue about in Bellwether. Some folks say Amos should have taken the settlement, walked away, and let the Holloway name sink under the weight of its own history. Others say he did something harder. They say he stayed close enough to make sure the people who came after him would not have to fight the same fight alone. So what do you think? Was Amos right to accept the bank's apology and help rebuild the place that betrayed him? Or should he have refused every dollar and demanded that Heritage Valley be shut down for good? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because there's no easy answer when justice arrives 50 years late. And if this story reminded you that the quietest person in the room may be carrying the truth everyone else is afraid to face, share this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us which part stayed with you the most.